Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Enduring Engagement, Retention Strategies for Online Learners. My name is Kristen Simone. A little bit about me. I have been teaching ESOL to adult learners since 2012. More specifically, I've been teaching pronunciation online for about a year now. I'm a certified K-12 world languages instructor, and I taught French in a Maryland public school district for 2 years from 2019 to 2021. So yes, that is right at the start of the pandemic with distance learning via Zoom and Canvas and all of that excitement with my middle schoolers. I also did curriculum work at the county level, so helping with mapping out the virtual learning program for French 1 in my school district. I've managed training programs and done work with education programs in the corporate sector and in government. But today, during my presentation, I'll be pulling mostly from my language teaching experience and sharing that with you. So in terms of our objectives, we are going to unpack 7 overarching elements to consider when we are mapping out online learning. I will share some ways of engaging with students online that have worked for me, and I invite you to reflect on strategies that have worked for you. So as you think about the suggestions that I'm going to share, look at how they align with your own strategies, your own successes, challenges, ideas. And then the ultimate goal will be to identify some best practices that you can then implement directly with your students. So to get you thinking, we are going to share. Take a moment to think back to engaging learning experience that you've been a part of. It could be as a student, as a teacher, a trainer, facilitator, observer, participant, basically any role where you've been a part of this learning experience. Think about the attitudes and actions of the people involved in that experience. Think about the layout of the learning environment. Where were you? Were you in a lecture hall, a classroom, an auditorium, on Zoom? What did you see? What did you hear? What did you say? What did you do? What about that experience captured your attention and motivated you to engage? Overall, think about what stood out to you that made this particular experience more memorable and more meaningful than other learning experiences that you've had. So take a moment to reflect, and then I'm going to invite you to type a word or a few words, up to 3 different words or phrases in Mentimeter. So I'm going to put this link here in Zoom for you. And then you can kind of reflect and share some ideas using Mentimeter, and we'll be able to see them pop up on the screen there. But I'm going to give you a few moments to reflect. If you have a smartphone and that's easier for you, you can scan the QR code. That's there for you as well. And they'll pop up over here. So decorated classroom, laughter, the expertise of the teacher. What defined your most engaging learning experience? Whatever the role was that you played in that experience, what defined that experience for you? Student voice was allowed, it was fun, it was active, systematic, there was movement, awesome, interactive. Helping students, physically engaged, awesome. Give a few more seconds just in case anyone's still typing. Okay, I see laughter again, so fun and laughter popping up a lot. Interactive and active. Awesome. All right, so I'm going to leave that there because it turns out that many of your contributions in that Mentimeter there are actually overlapping into what I'm going to call the 7 C's of engaging online learners. So we're going to look at these 7: captivate, communicate, capitalize, cultivate, collaborate, culminate, and of course, celebrate. There's that fun that you were talking about. So we're going to explore these one by one, getting started with captivate students from the start. So my recommendation is that you reach out to students before the class starts. Similar to an orientation before school starts, online we can actually reach out to students we are and let them know that we're excited about working with them. One way that I do this is through a getting to know you welcome video that I created on Google Slides. Students can hear my voice, they can see me, they can see what I look like, and they know what to expect before they come through that virtual door and see my big Hollywood square on their screen. They already kind of have an idea of who I am. In the video, I introduced myself, I introduced the class, I introduced our learning platform, which at HCC is called Canvas. And so usually I even have a few students who respond and introduce themselves, and they tell me that they're excited too. So we're already building those relationships up to a week before the class even starts. It's a welcoming way to get started. And if you are using a learning management system, Canvas, Moodle, maybe Blackboard or another one, you can send out an announcement. Otherwise, if you have access to email, just send a quick email using Loom, Google Slides, or whatever your preferred way of recording a video is. The next piece is to take that first step towards the students, and then you'll find that the students are willing to take their first steps as well. What do I mean by this? One of the key things in engaging online learners is creating a safe space for them. So I'm going to share a few routines that have worked for me, and maybe you do some of them in your online classroom as well. First, most folks these days are used to working and meeting online via Zoom, via Microsoft Teams, FaceTime, etc. But I don't want to assume that. So I generally start out that very first session with a quick overview of Zoom and kind of have the students use that interactivity to test out the different features. And then we get into one of my favorites and one of the students' favorites, mood meters. To build excitement at the start of every class and go beyond that, hi, how are you? Oh, I'm fine, how are you? I'm fine, and just back and forth, fine and you, fine and you. We can use a menu of GIFs here, or memes, or emojis, images, to take the temperature of the class while engaging students in a fun way. I usually use this exact set of GIFs on the first day because it's low stakes engagement. Students can use the Zoom chat, or they can even hold up the number of fingers, which is especially helpful for beginners who might not yet have a full range of vocabulary to express their, all of their feelings. So some different examples. I like to throw in vocabulary or concepts that we're learning in class. Like here, for example, you can see dangerous with the phonetic alphabet. Or maybe throw in some new expressions like hanging in there like Garfield. Or maybe you find all of those moving pictures overwhelming and you think your students might too, in which case you can just use simple pictures like you see here on the screen or like you see here. On this slide, you can see that I've moved from saying share in the chat to saying unmute and share as you come in. Once your students get more comfortable, or if you have a smaller group of students to begin with, you can invite students to speak out loud as they're coming in and maybe describe a bit more about why they chose whichever item they chose. If you and your students are comfortable with Zoom and all of its features, you can even use the annotations feature, and that will work such that students can actually put their little arrow, their marker, onto a particular icon or emoji, and then you can see all of the students at once until you clear the board. So just different ideas there for gauging the temperature of the class in an exciting and fun way. If you're interested in using these mood meters, I have compiled them for you here. I know that we all are using different platforms, so you can check out the PowerPoint there. Oh, and we'll get that dropped in the chat for you. And then there's Google Slides as well. Is that working? All right. So, oops, didn't mean to click on that. Keeping it moving. Smile. You are on camera. Right? I mean, maybe. Do you actually expect your students to be on camera during your live class sessions? And if that is your expectation, have you ever thought about why you want students to be on camera? So we know that there's been a good amount of discussion and even debate around camera use in online classes, particularly in 2020 at the start of the pandemic, during distance learning. There was a lot of conversation, especially in K through 12 learning, around equity, thinking about, for example, Wi-Fi bandwidth or distractions in the background, home environment, and so on. That would be a lot for us to unpack today. So let's focus more specifically on how we can use the camera to captivate students ourselves and then increase students' comfort with being on camera, especially in context where having the video activated is really a necessary part of the learning experience. For example, I teach pronunciation. So being able to see my students' mouths move is really important when it comes time to listen and repeat and offer feedback. But I can't just expect them to feel comfortable moving their mouths around in all kinds of awkward positions on camera from day one. Honestly, I don't even emphasize that expectation that cameras be on. I make sure mine is on and I try to look into the camera instead of on my screen. And when we do get to those listen and repeat segments, I actually do something a little bit interesting. I move my own mouth with them as they're repeating. So for example, I'll say, okay, everyone, listen and repeat. Photographer. So my mouth is moving, so I'm with them and they're encouraged to follow along with me since I don't have that necessarily live feedback that I would have otherwise. Kind of helps everyone stay in sync. All right, so how do we get there? One of the routines I do on the first day, it's one of the initial activities, is called turn on your camera if. Everyone turns off their cameras, me included, and we just have a black Zoom screen. Then I share a series of prompts where students turn on their camera if the prompt applies to them. For example, turn on your camera if you've participated in an online class meeting using Zoom before. Turn on your camera if you speak more than one language fluently. And here, I'd pause as the students turn on their cameras and kind of ask them about what their language background is. Turn on your camera if you come from this country or that country, this continent, this region, and we go through all of them. Once again, stopping to check in with each student to find out more specifics about who they are, where they come from. Then we move into details about the class. Are you excited? Are you nervous or fearful? What questions do you have? And by the end of it, I usually notice that any students that didn't start out with their camera on, they've now turned their cameras. And this is the segue into a breakout room activity where they can unpack those questions, doubts, excitements, all of that in a smaller group setting where they're also more likely to keep their camera on because there are less students involved. And so we just keep going from there to kind of build incrementally in terms of comfort. All right, that is captivating students from the start. Next up, we are going to communicate clear objectives and outcomes. Why are we here? It's important that we as teachers communicate our interests, our passions, what brings us to the table with the students to invest in their learning and success. And likewise, we also want to find out, why are the students taking our class? Why did they sign up for this tutoring session? Why are they participating in this study group at church? Or why did they join this community club at the library? Whatever the context may be, if we understand the students' personal goals and values, we can design the learning experience to best benefit them. Next up, we want to answer, what are we going to do? How? Why? Like, why are we learning this? Once you understand your students' needs and have established a course topic, or you have those overall course objectives, it can be really tempting to just, grab a textbook activity or an online worksheet or the last teacher's plans and call it a lesson, right? Honestly, that was how I started out 10 years ago when I began teaching ESOL at a college in France. I was fresh out of college myself. I didn't have any teaching experience. I didn't have any teacher training. And so it was really just an incredible opportunity to live abroad and teach English. And I learned a lot with that first group of students. But my next step was, how do I get this textbook task off of the page and make it interactive and engaging? How do I use these resources that I found or that I've inherited to meet the specific needs of my students? My teaching and learner engagement really took off when I flipped my approach based on professional development that I received and guidance from teacher mentors and observers. As I was planning, I started to ask myself some key questions. What will be the outcome of students doing this particular activity? How does this lesson move us toward the overall course objectives, or move my students towards meeting their personal and professional goals? How will we measure progress and success for the students and for me as the teacher? How will students know that they've achieved the outcome, whatever that outcome is? What type of indicators should I, as the teacher, be observing during the learning experience? And what type of feedback will I give students? What will be our next steps if students meet or don't meet the target? These types of questions create accountability and transparency in the learning process. They open up opportunities for students to self-assess and to build meaning around their learning. So let's talk about that a little bit more. Can anyone tell us what this means, what these stand for, these letters here stand for? Let's see. I don't know if we can pull up the Q&A or the chat, if there's any way. There we go. All right, I'm going to put that one up there. Thank you. All right, students will be able to. So I know this acronym is used a lot in K through 12 education, especially. There we go. But no matter what level or context you're teaching in, even if for some reason you choose not to present your learning agenda, your learning plan to the students, it's important that we as the teachers map out learning with objectives and outcomes in mind. So tell me, I have an example here. What is wrong with this objective? Or what could be improved with this objective statement here? Let me make this small. And it looks like the Q&A is the way to go. So you can share any thoughts or ideas you have there about what's going on with this objective. What's wrong with it? All right, on a roll here. Is everyone able to see, or do I have to publish the question first? All right, can't measure. Awesome. Okay, so I'll take both of those and keep us moving along. So you can't assess, awesome. You can't assess that they understand. There's no way to measure understand. There's no way to measure appreciation. Those aren't specific enough in terms of what we're actually looking for and how we'll know that we've achieved it. I'm going to put this back down here. So a starting point in making sure that we have specific and measurable goals, and I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this, is Bloom's taxonomy. So I know that many of you probably know about Bloom and other learning theories, but there may be others of you who are teaching in more informal contexts that don't necessarily require, a teaching degree or a background in instructional design. You might have just been thrown into some sort of teaching situation, kind of like I was, like I told you about, and you're just figuring things out as you go. So bear with me. Bloom's taxonomy offers us a hierarchy, basically a classification of cognitive skills, of thinking, that we can use to organize learning objectives and outcomes. So take a moment to look at these 6 steps here. We have remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. And you can kind of see those visual representatives of what's happening at each step along the way. But you may be thinking, well, Kristen, you said understand. Like, we shouldn't use that since it's not measurable. Well, the great thing is that there are plenty of visuals out there that give us suggestions for what understanding looks like concretely in measurable terms. For example, this inverted pyramid here, just a quick search on the internet, and I found this. You can see that those top three at the top, creating, evaluating, and analyzing, those are what we're aiming towards. That's where our learning progression should lead us, to those top three higher order thinking skills at the top. But you can find verb wheels and lists and charts all over the internet with all kinds of examples of different verbs and action words that you can use in defining your objectives. You can even find other learning theories that you can dive into to reflect more deeply about your learners and about the learning experience and learning process. One learning theory that I particularly like is Webb's depth of knowledge. We don't have time to unpack it today, but you can do a quick Google search and dig into that, and that can kind of help with defining your objectives as well. So just to kind of recap, once we take these specific and measurable behaviors that we get from Bloom, from Webb, from other learning theorists, then we can come up with a more concrete objective. By the end of the lesson today, it's time specific, students will be able to identify at least 5 words to describe music and use them to discuss music preferences. We can even give the learners a sort of guide for how they can measure that they've actually met that objective. I know 5 vocabulary words. I can describe my music preferences, and I can understand when my classmates communicate about their preferences. I also like to throw in the agenda just so that students know and I know what to expect during the class session. So moving on from here, we've talked about communicating clear objectives and outcomes, and now we are going to capitalize on what students bring to the table. So what are our students' backgrounds? What do they already know? We can find out that via practice tasks, once again, low stakes, no grades, at the very beginning of the class. If you're using technology or learning management system like Canvas or Blackboard, you could put some questions similar to what you see on your screen there, just to kind of get to know the learners and find out what they already know. At Howard Community College in the English Language Center, we also have an established pre-test and post-test that are one and the same. Back when I started, it was really interesting to me that students would have the same assessment coming in as they have going out. But an advantage to this is that it shows students growth, and it also ensures that students know what they're doing by the time they get to that graded summative assessment at the end of class. They don't get to hold on to their initial results, so they can't like copy and use the same answers again. It's just to establish a baseline. And then another important thing to note is that it's usually a quiz-based section. There's a quiz-based section of the assessment, but then there's also a sort of performative element. They're speaking, they're writing, they might be listening in order to respond. And so that's hard to imitate from the beginning and then, 8 to 12 weeks later. An important thing that this also helped to teach me is that assessments are not about tricking students. It's not about putting difficult questions that make the students have to think really hard beyond what we've kind of helped them or assisted them with doing throughout the course. But rather, assessments show students what they know and are capable of. And importantly, they also give the teacher and different staff members who are involved in the learning process the insights that they need to evaluate and adjust for the student's benefit. So the key here is emphasizing the skills and knowledge that students have, so that we can operate from a strengths-based mindset instead of a deficit mindset. Students bring other languages, professional skills, experiences to the table, and we want to really highlight those and leverage them. Similar to what Brent Stubbs was saying yesterday during the keynote, if you attended that yesterday, about teaching content versus teaching students and making sure that students are aware of their potential. Another important consideration here is the language that we use when talking to and about our students. In the ESOL world, We have noticed, especially in K through 12, that we're gradually shifting away from a sort of deficit vocabulary to we move to a English-centric vocabulary. English is dominant and desirable, to finally now embracing all of the linguistic diversity that a student brings with them in the term multilingual learners. So the emphasis, like I said, is no longer on a deficiency or a lack, not a lack of English, not a lack of digital literacy, not a lack of formal schooling, but rather we're focusing on building up the knowledge and skills so that that student can communicate and effectively navigate the world around them. So you might even notice a shift in the way the student talks about themselves and thinks about themselves as a result of the language and the terms that you're using when describing them. This comes up a lot in the pronunciation class that I teach, because students will come in saying, I have a bad English accent. And I constantly remind them that our goal isn't to fix your accent or even eliminate your accent. That's part of your identity. And for me, and hopefully for everyone else as well, it's a beautiful part of who you are. Our goal is to improve comprehensibility so that the students can understand and be understood. So there's a difference there, and that comes through the language. All right, next up, we are going to cultivate curiosity and an empowering classroom culture. That's number 4 there. So speaking of pronunciation, at the top of the list here in this category is the importance of saying students' names a lot and saying them correctly. Ask the student, how do I pronounce it? Attempt and attempt again and again and again until you get it right. No nicknames, no, well, this is how we say it in English. None of that, no changes, no compromise, unless the student specifically tells you that you should refer to them in another way than their sort of given name. We don't want to shy away from calling on a student just because we can't pronounce their name. And that happens. And it's especially difficult for younger learners, maybe elementary school, middle school, who don't necessarily know how to assert themselves. And so they end up with these mispronunciations and sort of names that are given to them that aren't really their names. And it's not going to help them to engage and really feel welcome in our classrooms if that's happening. We can also learn about students' lives and find ways to weave whatever we're learning about them into the content. For example, having them share fun facts or relatable stories, tying it into their jobs, their interests, their experiences. All right, next up, okay. Establishing routines and recurring activities. So some that I like to do virtually to get the flow of learning going is know, want to know, learned. Maybe you've seen this this chart before. So in short, we can say KWL, where students reflect on a topic beforehand to see what background knowledge they have coming in. They think about what they want to know, their desired knowledge, and then they revisit this chart after the lesson to evaluate what they've learned. So I tend to use Google Suite for this, either Google Docs or Google Slides, just like you see there on your screen. But sometimes I have students who prefer to write or draw on a sheet of paper, and then they can just take a picture or scan it if I want to be able to evaluate with them. Otherwise, you could also use Padlet, which allows for collective contributions where you can see what everyone's contributing. So that's really, really nice, excuse me. And then another routine or recurring activity that I tend to do with students is the See, Think, Wonder model, which is great in classes where I show videos or introduce an infographic, especially with cultural content. So it can be done with a virtual capture sheet similar to the KWL chart. But one of the key things here is that whenever we show a video, we want to think back to those clear objectives that we outlined. Why are we showing this video? Because otherwise learners might just disengage when we press play. They're no longer watching because they don't know why they're watching. So a capture sheet for them to guide comprehension is really good. Otherwise, simply stating something like, as you watch these videos, identify 3 greetings that you observe in Francophone culture. Now they're looking and listening for those 3 greetings, and they have a reason to tune in rather than to zone out. Another one that I do specifically in the pronunciation class is round robins. And so this is me taking that textbook activity and transforming it into something that's actually going to allow the students to engage and interact. So this is a great alternative to breakout rooms when you really want to check for understanding to make sure all of your students have captured the content. So I will take a textbook example like the one you see here, and I'll just take out the partner part of it and put round robin there. And so then what would happen, for example, in this exercise, Bruna here, the first student, would choose either A or B in column 1. She would look at number 1 and she would choose to say either the cold sentence or the gold sentence. And then based on what Juliana hears, she's going to respond with either the A sentence or the B sentence in column 2. And once Bruna's done, then it's Juliana's turn to choose from column 2 for Saeed. Saeed responds to Juliana, and so on and so forth. And it's just a quick fire way to make sure that all of the students are capturing and have produced what we're looking for in the target language there. So continuing with establishing routines and recurring activities, our final piece is to make sure that we're giving students options and that we're using and encouraging multiple modalities, keeping in mind that not everyone, and we've seen this in other presentations over the course of the conference, not everyone is on the same page digitally. All right, so we give learners options from no tech to advanced tech, from auditory to visual to kinesthetic. Maybe they can answer a question by unmuting and speaking, or sending an emoji, or giving a thumbs up, either using the reactions or their actual thumbs, showing a certain number of fingers on the screen, all different ways to engage learners. And so some examples of how I've done that before is here with my French students, and they were creating a passport, their own passport to travel the Francophone world at the start of the course. And I gave them 3 options: the low tech, take a piece of paper, write it out, draw it out, have fun, take a picture, send it to me. All the way up to the high tech, where I actually gave them a template that they could use, or they could create their own in Google Slides to find pictures and sort of make a collage. And so students had fun with that. Most of them did end up choosing option C, but I had some who even got creative, like this student here. She created a video using a tool called Flip a Clip, and she made her passport into a video, which was really cool. So just giving learners those options for how they want to engage and still producing the same sort of outcomes. We're still measuring the same mastery there. Okay. This is a similar example with my pronunciation students, where they could either annotate a text that they wrote, a speech that they prepared using handwritten symbols, or else I showed them how they could use Google Docs or Microsoft Word to do it on the computer if they preferred. And I've had both. So really great for students to have choices. Next step, collaborate interactively and inclusively. So have a look at this Twitter quote here, and I invite you to take a stance. Does good teaching require a PowerPoint or not? Do you have strong feelings about this? Do you use PowerPoints in your lessons? Are they a staple in your lessons, like you have to have them? Or is it more of a, no, I don't really need those? On Twitter, the folks who responded here had some pretty intense and strong sort of stances on it. Folks on Twitter had a lot to say. We had the naysayers. Read what Steve Jobs had to say about them. If you know what you're talking about, you don't need a slideshow to keep people engaged. And then bad instruction requires PowerPoint or Google Slides. And then sort of the responses to those. And then you have the flip side with someone who comes in and says, unless you're an online teacher, then interactive slide decks are awesome. And then different, technology that you can use. So I asked you this question as we transition from cultivate to collaborate, because the goal of any technology should be to benefit students and amplify learning, right? Not put them to sleep, which sometimes PowerPoints are known to do. So once again, we reflect. Why am I incorporating this technology? How does it align with the objective? What do I want students to know, to do, to understand, to produce? You can even ask, is this technology the best means of achieving that goal? If so, why? If not, what's a better way? Maybe there's a better tool. That said, Google Slides has totally won me over. I used to be strongly opposed, and I didn't use it for maybe the first 5 to 7 years of my teaching. But these days, I don't know how I could teach online without them. Sometimes my love for words and clarity translates to dense slides like this one that you see here on the screen. But a wise mentor of mine, who happens to be in the room, emphasized the power of pictures. And so I'm working on reducing words and replacing those words with pictures that will give me cues so that I can keep the lesson moving for the learners, and give students images to represent ideas and directions, which is especially important when we're working with languages and teaching languages. So you can see, for example, here, this is in French, but you might even be able to understand, even if you don't speak French, what you're supposed to do with this Edpuzzle activity, right? Because those images are there, and it's also introducing students to those key words so that they can build their language vocabulary. Next up, in collaborating interactively and inclusively, find your favorites. Nope, I'm not talking about your students. Don't play favorites with your students. I'm actually talking about your ed tech staples. So I told you Google Slides is the go-to for me, but maybe you have other preferences. So when I was teaching in person, the whiteboard and textbooks, worksheets, handouts, document camera, those were all staples. I use them all the time. And I could see the students on the book page. I can do guided notes with the document camera, interactive worksheets for pair activities where they're writing and asking and answering questions, could scribble on the board anytime I wanted, and bring group tasks off of the page by having students rotate around on the board. All of those were great in person. But then COVID came and I ended up online abruptly. So what do I do? What do we do? We had to find online equivalents for these types of interactive and collaborative lessons, right? So the Google Suite, along with Zoom, breakout rooms, it can give students a similar level of action. Don't be afraid of those breakout rooms. Once you sort of establish the norms, and then you can throw in other platforms as well. The great thing about Google is that we can actually track changes. And so if you're sitting in one place and you have all of your students in different breakout rooms, but you have them all working on the same Google Doc or Google Slide or Google Jamboard, you can see the changes that are happening on the document in each room, which shows you that learners are working, that they're talking together, and that they're figuring it out. Another advantage that we've gained is that we can consult them anytime. So we can always come back and review what we've learned and shared. Importantly, we also want to think about inclusivity. So I'm sure that many of us, if we've been working online for any amount of time with students, we've experienced that ghost student who hides behind the screen. But in reality, that might just be a quiet student who engages differently. That note taker that would have been in the front of the class, not talking, but just scribbling away and participating and engaging. But now that they're on Zoom, they feel uncomfortable. They don't like being seen. So one way to give all learners time and space is equitable participation practices. Of course, you have your wait time, so allowing students time to think. Maybe that means saying something like, type your response in the chat, but don't press enter until I say go. Everybody think about it and type it. And then when I say go, 1, 2, 3, go. And then all of the responses are there, and you've given everybody time to think. And to avoid engaging the same student all the time, you could even go back to what some folks did in person with calling sticks. They have virtual versions that you can find on Google, Chrome, or other platforms. But the caveat here is, once again, making sure that you're giving students time to prepare. You're not cold calling. For example, you might say something like, Julia, in 2 minutes, we're going to check in with you about X and get your thoughts, okay? So go ahead and think about it. We're going to check in with you in just a moment. Or, Luke, before you share your answer, tell us how confident you are in this answer. Now, if Luke says something like 10% and then he gets it wrong, he doesn't feel embarrassed or uncomfortable because he let everybody know up front that he wasn't completely confident. And sometimes I do this with the whole class. And I'll say, all right, how confident are you with your answers? If you're just feeling like 0, like I don't understand at all, down here, all the way up to 100%. I can just see on the screen where students are feeling about the activity. And it might be an opportunity for me to reteach, or even an opportunity for a student who's understood to explain it to their classmate in words that I couldn't. So these multiple modalities from collaboration are key here to make sure that all students can engage. Quiet students might appreciate the chat or Padlet or the Google Suite where they can type. Students who are hesitant to come off mute might appreciate video recordings, because then they have multiple times to record and no one's looking at them, but they're still producing that spoken result. And creative students could use Flipgrid, Flip a Clip, Loom, and other creative platforms. Okay, moving right along to culminate. So culminate in authentic applications of learning. So in thinking about the dictionary definition of culminate, to end or arrive at the final stage, to reach the highest point. What is the highest point in our learning progression? What will students have to show for their efforts? How will they apply the new knowledge and skills to demonstrate mastery? This goes back to those learning theories and our objective statements, but here what we're thinking about is products more than processes. In language learning, will students produce a result that is presentational, interpretive, interpersonal? Will they be listening, speaking, reading, writing? Will they be expected to transfer concepts that they've learned, maybe grammar or vocabulary, to practical applications? The idea is that here we want students to be invested in something applicable, something tangible, shifting away from the theories and the rules to more concrete applications. We might consider things like project-based learning or performance-based learning, real-life applications and scenarios. So maybe think about some culminating projects that your students have produced, or ideas that you have for what your students could produce to really apply this to real-life situations. Here's an example from my French students on the screen. You and your family are on a trip to Vietnam, and you've discovered a French restaurant where everybody's speaking French. Create a role play of your restaurant experience there. And so once again, I gave the students options from very simple, using audio only, with a caveat. I had to be able to discern who was speaking when. So I literally had students making deep voices like this, and then high-pitched voices. That was fine. I didn't see them on camera, but I heard their voices and I could evaluate them. To recording videos, and I gave examples of different ways that they could use props or action figures or disguises to act out the different roles. And then we even had a more creative option for students who wanted to use maybe Powtoon and Flip a Clip and all of that to draw or design their cartoons. And so these are just some snapshots of what I got. Just amazingness with all students showing what they'd learned in terms of French foods and restaurant vocabulary, but in a real life context. If they go to a French-speaking country, they need to be able to use this vocabulary realistically. And so we got PowerPoints with even had the transcription at the top so I could read along, students drawing, theatrical performances with props. One student did those voices like I told you. And so just those options, but this is a real life application and it's meaningful for them because now they can use it when they do travel to a French-speaking country and dine there. So we're culminating in those authentic applications of learning. And finally, we get to the fun. Celebrate student effort and success. So I have quite a few different strategies here. Starting with the idea of embracing differences of ideas, especially in our classroom. We have immigrant students and international students, lots of blends of cultures and practices. We want to make sure that we're open and accepting to everything that students might be bringing to the table. And we've talked about that in many of the other presentations as well, but we're celebrating those. We're keeping it celebratory. And then practicing compassion and acknowledging the arrival of late students and absent students. This was such a big one at the start of the pandemic when I was teaching in secondary schools. So I had to learn to warmly welcome latecomers, because if I didn't acknowledge them and I just let them slip into the class, it could seem like I didn't care. And then that would just encourage them to be a ghost or not to come. But if I focused on their lateness and I'm like, hey, why are you late? Or you're late again for the 5th time or something like that, asking questions or drawing attention to it, then that would discourage them. It might also cause them to disengage further. So I never really knew what the situations were, what their life experiences were that might cause them to be late. So I embraced them with grace. As soon as there was a pause in the instruction or in the student talking, I would say something like, hi, Tina, we're just working on blah, blah, blah. I'm so glad you're here so that we can get started on XYZ, right? And just bring her right into the activity. If I was in a breakout room with students and I was observing or offering guidance, I would bring Tina into that breakout room where I was so that she could immediately get involved in a small group with her fellow students, as opposed to just leaving her there lingering with no one in the main room. And I'm trying to rush with the students in the breakout room, just bring her right in. And that way she's incorporated. Of course, there may be cause for gentle reminders or setting up time for a conference to talk about that chronic lateness, chronic absenteeism. But generally, I'd say that online class time is not the moment to put students on the spot. And so I try to celebrate just the fact that they're there. I'm so happy you're here and glad you could make it when you did. Another key here is acknowledging and appreciating students' contributions. This includes thanking students for reaching out via email. So making sure that before you start to address whatever question or whatever they're emailing about, you just say, thanks for reaching out to me. And that's a great opportunity also to model language for your language learners. Rather than correcting any mistakes they make in the email, you can model it in your return message and they'll see that there. An interesting one for me here is when students catch my mistakes and then they either tell me in class or they email me about it. And I know that it takes a lot of courage for them to speak up to me and to let me know. And so it's important that they do that, because otherwise, we talked about how we have these online records just lingering in Google Slides and so forth, and it would just be there. So I'm so appreciative to them when they point it out to me, and I make sure that I show that appreciation. Now, when it comes to students' mistakes, how do we provide feedback? We talk a lot about the praise sandwich and other different types of approaches we can take to make sure that we're framing feedback positively. So instead of announcing to the class, 2 people haven't done the quiz yet. John, why haven't you done the quiz, right? We can try, yes, we had 80% of the class to finish the task. And if you haven't submitted yet, it's not too late. We're gonna get to 100%. And if you do have to speak to John, it's more like, John, how can I support you? Or how can we get you, finished up? Keeping that positivity and that celebratory spirit going. And when you're writing feedback, for example, instead of saying something like, you missed the verb, maybe consider, oh, remember the verb next time, or you didn't include X. Maybe consider something like, oh, I like how you did Y. It'd be great to see you do the same thing with X. So just kind of flipping the language to keep it positive and keep students encouraged is one way that we can celebrate all along. And then, of course, once we get to the end of the course, we want to make sure that we're congratulating students on completing that. In person, we would often have parties or celebrations, and you can have a Zoom party, have students, dress up, do a theme, play some games, just make it a celebration so that students really feel proud of their accomplishments and their progress. Speaking of progress, one final consideration is how you and your students are defining success. We can redefine success. It's not perfection, but progress. For example, achieving completely correct English is arguably impossible, even for native speakers, right? But comprehensible English is more reasonable and attainable And so we can champion that for our students to help them have reasonable expectations. And when we follow this model, from captivating students from the start and communicating clear and specific goals at the start of every lesson, moving all the way to culminating in projects and performances that are anchored in real world contexts and celebrating students, we will have so much to celebrate, right? And we'll be sure that we can keep students remaining engaged and active at each step along the way. So with that, if you have any questions or ideas, I'm going to pull up the Q&A here and see what your thoughts are. All right. How can teachers improve retention in their classes in the middle of the semester? This is my first year teaching an ESL class at the center. While there are many students in the roster, I saw numbers go down after the first month about 30%. I believe that most of the students have dropped out or haven't been showing up due to constant tech issues on their end. However, I'm concerned with what I may be doing wrong that is affecting retention rates. So thank you for that question. This is something that I experienced a lot with distance learning when I was teaching middle school. And one of the things that I did that took a lot of time, but that was worth it, was I reached out to them directly outside of the live class session. I'm not sure if you've already done that, but if you have access to their email addresses, even phone numbers, if that's allowed within your center, reach out to them, see what's going on. Because your center may even have, if you're thinking it's tech issues, I know that at Howard Community College, we have a dedicated team that works with students to navigate the technology so that they don't have that barrier to entry in the lesson, so that they're not leaving out. So I would say to check in with the students, but maybe before checking in with the students, even check in with your center staff to see what resources you might be able to bring to those students once you do touch base with them. Does that answer that question, or any other questions that we have related to strategies for engaging online learners? Awesome. All right. All right. So we are going to put a link in the chat for the survey. We'd appreciate if you could fill it out. Let us know how this session went for you. Give me some feedback there. It's in the chat for you. And otherwise, a big thank you to you. And I hope you enjoyed the conference. I think this is this is the last presentation here, unless you go back and watch the recordings. So thanks so much for joining us and being with us.